In the summer of 1862, a Union officer sat down to write a report that he hoped no one in Washington would ever have to read twice. He had just discovered that nearly every major troop movement his army made over the previous 6 weeks had been known to the Confederates before his own soldiers knew it. Someone was reading his mail. Someone was counting his cannons. Someone was standing close enough to hear his generals argue and far enough away to never get caught. That someone was not a soldier. She wore silk dresses and hosted dinner parties 3 blocks from the White House, and by the time anyone figured out what she was doing, the damage was already stitched into the outcome of a war. This is the story of how the Confederacy built one of the most effective espionage operations in American history, how it placed eyes and ears inside the Union's own capital, how it fed Robert E. Lee a stream of intelligence that most commanding generals only dream about, and how, despite all of it, the South still lost. Not because the information was bad, not because the spies failed, but because knowing what your enemy is going to do and being able to stop him are 2 entirely different wars, fought with 2 entirely different weapons, and the Confederacy only ever had the first one. Washington, D.C. in 1861 was not the fortified, guarded city it would later become. It was a southern town in almost every way that mattered, sitting just across the Potomac from Virginia, filled with families who had cousins in the Confederate Army and neighbors who still believed in the cause even as they smiled at Union officers over breakfast. Into this city walked a woman named Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a widow with a sharp mind, a wide social circle, and a hatred for the Union that she never bothered to hide from her diary, even as she hid it perfectly from everyone else. Greenhow had spent years cultivating friendships with powerful men in Washington, senators, generals, even a sitting Supreme Court justice, and when war broke out, she simply kept doing what she had always done. She listened, she flattered, she asked questions that seemed harmless and remembered every answer. By July of 1861, Greenhow had built a small but devastating network of couriers who could move information across enemy lines using coded messages sewn into clothing, hidden in hollowed-out fruit, and passed hand to hand through a chain of Confederate sympathizers who lived openly among Union soldiers without a hint of suspicion. When General Irvin McDowell prepared to march his army toward Manassas, Greenhow learned the exact date of the advance from a source inside the War Department itself, and she sent that information south in a cipher so simple it barely qualified as one, a message rolled into a bundle of thread and carried by a young courier who walked straight past Union sentries without a second glance. General P.G. Beauregard received the warning in time to call for reinforcements, and when the 2 armies finally collided at Bull Run, the Confederates were not surprised. They were waiting. The Union lost that battle badly, and while the loss cannot be pinned on Greenhow alone, the timing of her warning gave Confederate commanders something no army wants to go without, which is time. Time to shift troops, time to choose ground, time to turn a defensive scramble into a coordinated stand. Jefferson Davis himself would later credit her network with playing a direct role in the Confederate victory, and Greenhow wore that credit like a medal for the rest of her life, even after Union detectives finally placed her under house arrest and then in the old Capitol prison, where she kept smuggling messages out through her own daughter, an 8-year-old girl who carried notes to visitors without anyone thinking to search a child. Greenhow was eventually exiled to the South, where she was greeted as a hero. But her network did not die with her arrest. It multiplied. The Confederacy had learned a lesson that would shape the rest of the war, which is that Washington was porous, that Southern sympathy ran deeper in the capital than anyone in the Union High Command wanted to admit, and that a well-placed woman with a good memory could be worth more than a regiment. What followed was the construction of something far more organized than a single spy ring, the Confederate Signal Corps, originally built for battlefield communication using flags and torches, quietly absorbed a Secret Service bureau whose sole purpose was intelligence gathering and courier operations between Richmond and the North. This bureau ran what became known as the Secret Line, a chain of safe houses and river crossings stretching from Washington down through Maryland and across the Potomac into Virginia, allowing letters, newspapers, and verbal reports to move south in a matter of days. Confederate agents in Washington read Northern newspapers cover to cover, not for propaganda, but for military value, because Union papers in the early years of the war were shockingly casual about printing troop numbers, unit movements, and even planned offensives, treating military secrecy as an afterthought compared to selling copies. Confederate operatives simply clipped the relevant articles, added their own observations, and sent the bundle south along the secret line, where it would land on a desk in Richmond within a week. This was not glamorous work. It did not involve disguises or dramatic escapes most of the time. It involved patience, memorization, and an unglamorous kind of courage that meant carrying a folded piece of paper across a river at night, knowing that if you were caught, you would likely hang. The people who did this work were shopkeepers, farmers, boatmen, free black couriers pressed or paid into service, and Southern women who used the assumption of female harmlessness as their greatest weapon, because Union provost marshals rarely searched a woman's hoop skirt or a basket of eggs with the same thoroughness they searched a man's coat. The mechanics of the secret line were almost embarrassingly simple once you understand them, which is part of why they worked for as long as they did. A message written in Richmond could reach a safe house in southern Maryland within 2 days, carried by a rider who knew which farms would feed him and which would report him. From there, a waterman familiar with the tides and the patrol schedules of Union gunboats would cross the Potomac at night in a small skiff, sometimes rowing, sometimes drifting with muffled oars past picket boats whose sentries were often half asleep or half drunk on a river that never seemed to end. Not far from Greenhow in the Shenandoah Valley, a teenager named Belle Boyd was building a reputation of her own, one that would eventually make her nearly as famous. Boyd was 17 when the war began, living in Martinsburg, and she had none of Greenhow's Washington connections or social polish. What she had instead was nerve, a willingness to flirt information out of Union officers billeted in her own family's house, and an eye for terrain that made her useful to Confederate commanders operating in the valley. In May of 1862, as Stonewall Jackson pushed north through the Shenandoah in the campaign that would make his name, Boyd ran nearly a mile across open ground under fire to reach Confederate lines outside Front Royal, carrying word that Union forces there were weaker than Jackson believed, and that a fast strike could catch them before reinforcements arrived. Jackson later credited her information directly, sending her a note of thanks the same day. Belle Boyd was arrested at least 6 times over the course of the war and imprisoned twice, and each time she was released, she went back to doing exactly what had gotten her arrested in the first place, because by then, she understood something the Union authorities were slow to accept, which is that public humiliation and short imprisonment did almost nothing to deter someone
who believed she was fighting for her home rather than an abstract cause. Robert E. Lee, once he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia in the summer of 1862, became the direct beneficiary of this entire apparatus. Lee has often been described by historians as an aggressive general, a man willing to divide his forces in the face of a larger enemy and gamble on speed and audacity. What gets discussed less often is that Lee's aggression was not blind, it was informed. Before the 7 Days battles pushed McClellan's army away from Richmond, Lee had received detailed reports on Union troop positions and strength from cavalry scouting under J.E.B. Stuart, combined with civilian intelligence funneled up through the same networks Greenhow had helped establish. Stuart's now famous ride completely around McClellan's army in June of 1862 was not just a bold cavalry stunt. It was a reconnaissance mission that confirmed exactly what Lee needed to know, which was that the Union right flank was exposed and vulnerable. Lee used that information to launch an offensive that drove McClellan away from the Confederate capital entirely. The Peninsula campaign that preceded the 7 Days gives an even clearer picture of how deeply this intelligence advantage shaped Lee's early decisions. When McClellan landed his massive army at Fort Monroe in the spring of 1862 and began his slow, methodical crawl up the peninsula toward Richmond, Confederate observers tracked nearly every step of it, not through any single dramatic feat of espionage, but through the accumulated weight of dozens of small reports. Farmers along the York and James rivers counted transport ships and passed the numbers to local Confederate commanders. Free and enslaved Black Virginians, whose knowledge of the region's roads and waterways often exceeded that of the invading Union soldiers, were sometimes coerced and sometimes willing participants in relaying troop sightings, though their role in Confederate intelligence has historically been under-examined, precisely because it complicates the narrative of who was serving the Confederacy and why. McClellan, famously convinced that he was outnumbered by Confederate forces nearly twice his actual strength, made his own contribution to the problem by trusting inflated estimates from Allen Pinkerton's early intelligence operation, estimates that had nothing to do with Confederate deception and everything to do with Pinkerton's flawed counting methods. The result was a Union commander moving with excessive caution against a Confederate army that, thanks to its own accurate intelligence, understood exactly how much room that caution created. Lee exploited that room ruthlessly during the 7 Days, attacking McClellan's flanks even while outnumbered overall, because he knew precisely where the Union army was thin and precisely how slowly McClellan was likely to react. Then came Antietam, and here the story briefly flips, because it was the Union that stumbled onto Lee's plans, not the other way around, when 2 soldiers found a copy of Special Order 191 wrapped around a bundle of cigars in an abandoned campsite. That single piece of bad luck should have destroyed Lee's entire Maryland campaign, and it nearly did. But even then, Confederate intelligence sources in Maryland warned Lee that his plans had somehow been compromised, giving him just enough time to consolidate his scattered divisions before McClellan, moving with his usual caution, despite holding the single greatest intelligence gift of the entire war, failed to press his advantage fast enough to destroy Lee outright. The battle that followed at Antietam was still the bloodiest single day in American history, and it was still a strategic Confederate withdrawal, but Lee's army survived to fight another 2.5 years, in part because his own intelligence network gave him just enough warning to react.
By 1863, the Confederate spy network in Washington had matured into something resembling a professional operation, though it never had the funding or centralized control that term implies.
Elizabeth Van Lew, ironically, was doing the same thing in reverse from inside Richmond for the Union, running her own network under the nose of the Confederate government, which is worth mentioning only to make clear that this was not a one-sided war of shadows. Both capitals leaked. But in the specific case of Lee's campaigns through 1862 and into the spring of 1863, the flow of usable, timely intelligence ran heavily in his favor, and nowhere was that more obvious than at Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville is remembered as Lee's masterpiece, the battle where he split his already outnumbered army not once, but twice in the face of Joseph Hooker's much larger force, and won anyway. What made that gamble possible was not raw genius alone. Lee and Stonewall Jackson had accurate reports on the position of the Union's exposed right flank, reports that came from a combination of cavalry reconnaissance and local civilians who knew the wilderness terrain better than any Union mapmaker, and were more than willing to share that knowledge with Confederate officers who spoke their language and shared their politics. Jackson's flank march through dense woodland to smash into the unsuspecting Union 11th Corps was executed with a confidence that only comes from knowing, not guessing, where the enemy actually was. Hooker, despite commanding a force nearly twice the size of Lee's, was outmaneuvered so completely that he later admitted he simply lost his nerve, and part of that loss of nerve came from the unsettling realization that Lee always seemed to know exactly where to strike.
If the story ended there, this would be a very different kind of video, one about how intelligence wins wars. But it does not end there, because 2 months later, at Gettysburg, the very network that had served Lee so well fell apart at the worst possible moment. And the reason it fell apart says almost everything about why superior information could not save the Confederacy in the long run. J.E.B. Stuart, the cavalry commander who had provided Lee with priceless reconnaissance throughout 1862 and early 1863, took his cavalry on another long ride around the Union Army in late June of 1863, hoping to repeat the glory of his earlier exploits. This time, the ride went wrong. Stuart's cavalry became separated from the main Confederate army for over a week, cut off by Union forces that had grown more competent at screening their own movements, and Lee marched into Pennsylvania effectively blind, without the eyes he had relied on for a year. He did not know exactly where the Union Army of the Potomac was. He did not know its strength, its formation, or its intentions, until Confederate forces stumbled into Union cavalry almost by accident outside a small town called Gettysburg. The battle that followed was not one Lee chose with the confidence of full information. It was a battle he backed into, and the absence of the very intelligence apparatus that had defined his previous victories is one of the most cited explanations for why Gettysburg unraveled the way it did. Confederate cavalry under Stuart had used similar rides earlier in the war to spectacular effect, and it is worth understanding why the same tactic that produced brilliant results in 1862 produced disaster in 1863, because the difference was not Stuart's skill so much as the changing competence of the army he was riding around. By the summer of 1863, Union cavalry under commanders like Alfred Pleasonton had absorbed hard lessons from 2 years of being consistently outridden and outscouted by their Confederate counterparts, and they had grown into a force that could screen the Army of the Potomac's movements far more effectively than before. When Stuart set out on his ride ahead of the invasion of Pennsylvania, he found Union forces positioned in ways that slowed him, forced him into skirmishes he had not planned for, and ultimately pulled him so far off his intended path that he lost contact with Lee's main army for 8 critical days. Lee, meanwhile, advanced into unfamiliar territory, relying on scattered reports from Confederate sympathizers in Pennsylvania, who simply did not have the military knowledge or the network density that had made Virginia and Maryland such fertile ground for intelligence gathering. A Pennsylvania farmer might tell a Confederate forager where the nearest Union regiment had been seen the day before, but he could not offer the kind of systematic troop counts and movement patterns that Lee had come to depend on. Without Stuart and without a mature spy network north of the Mason-Dixon line, Lee was operating with a fraction of the situational awareness that had defined every major victory of his career. This is the paradox sitting at the center of the entire story. The same Confederate general who benefited more than perhaps any other commander in American history with a functioning spy and reconnaissance network suffered his most devastating defeat in the one campaign where that network briefly collapsed. And even when the network worked exactly as intended, even when Lee knew precisely what the Union Army was going to do before it did it, the Confederacy still lost the war. That fact alone should stop anyone from assuming that espionage is destiny. The deeper reason lies in what intelligence can and cannot actually do. Spies can tell a general where the enemy is. They cannot manufacture soldiers to meet them with. Rose Greenhow's network could report troop movements out of Washington with remarkable accuracy, but it could not add a single rifle to Confederate armories or a single recruit to Confederate ranks. The Union, even when its generals moved slowly or made mistakes that Southern intelligence exploited beautifully, had an industrial base, a population, and a supply chain that dwarfed anything the Confederacy could match. And no amount of advance warning changes the arithmetic of a war of attrition. By 1864, when Ulysses S. Grant took command of Union forces, this arithmetic became brutally explicit. Grant knew that Lee could outmaneuver him tactically, and he stopped trying to outsmart him the way Hooker or McClellan had. Instead, Grant simply kept attacking, absorbing losses that would have broken previous Union commanders, because he understood that the Union could replace its casualties and the Confederacy could not. Confederate intelligence could tell Lee exactly where Grant's army was moving during the Overland campaign, and it often did. But knowing that Grant was coming did nothing to change the fact that Grant kept coming anyway, battle after battle, refusing to retreat the way every Union general before him had. There is also the matter of what happened to the spy networks themselves as the war ground on. Union counterintelligence improved dramatically after the early chaos of 1861, when a Southern sympathizing widow could walk freely through Washington drawing rooms, collecting secrets from careless generals. Allan Pinkerton's early detective work was clumsy in its military estimates, but effective in its policing, and he built a network of informants inside Washington's boarding houses and hotels, specifically to identify Confederate sympathizers who might be passing information south. Agents who had operated with near impunity in 1861 found themselves watched, followed, and in some cases arrested on evidence gathered from their own careless correspondence. Lafayette Baker, who took over much of the Union's internal security apparatus as the war progressed, ran an operation far more aggressive and far less concerned with legal niceties than Pinkerton's had been, arresting suspected agents on rumor alone and holding them without trial for weeks at a time. This kind of pressure did not eliminate Confederate espionage in Washington, but it fragmented it, forcing operatives to work in smaller, more isolated cells that could no longer share information as freely
or move it as quickly as the secret line once had. Couriers who had crossed the Potomac dozens of times without incident began disappearing, arrested at river crossings that Union patrols had finally learned to watch. The very success of early Confederate espionage taught the Union how vulnerable it had been, and the Union adapted, closing the gaps one by one until the free flow of intelligence that had shaped 1862 and early 1863 slowed to something far more uncertain and far less timely. By 1864 and 1865, the flow of high-quality intelligence to Lee had slowed to a fraction of what it once was, right at the moment the Confederacy needed it most. Trapped in the trenches around Petersburg, with an army that was shrinking by the week, while Grant's forces only grew, reinforced by fresh recruits and immigrant enlistees in numbers the Confederacy could no longer imagine matching.
Knows more automatically wins. And it is worth being honest about why that version does not survive contact with the actual record. Knowledge without the material means to act on it is simply an accurate description of your own defeat arriving on schedule. Lee could know, with near certainty, that Grant intended to slide his army around the Confederate right flank during the Overland Campaign, and Confederate scouts did report exactly that intention on more than one occasion, and it changed almost nothing about the outcome, because Lee's army lacked the reserves to both hold its current lines and reinforce the point of attack in time. Grant's own aide later observed that Grant seemed almost indifferent to the fact that Lee often anticipated his moves, because Grant's strategy did not depend on surprise the way earlier Union commanders had. It depended on relentlessness, on a willingness to keep feeding men and material into the fight regardless of losses, a resource that Confederate intelligence, however excellent, simply could not manufacture more of. Every scrap of information smuggled across the Potomac told Lee what was coming. None of it told him where he was going to find the soldiers to stop it. It is worth pausing on what this work actually cost the people who did it, because the story of Confederate espionage is too often told as a chess match between generals, when the actual labor was carried out by people whose names rarely made it into any official report. A waterman ferrying messages across the Potomac in the middle of the night was risking his life for a war he might not have even chosen to fight in any other way, and if caught, he faced execution as a spy rather than the comparatively survivable fate of a captured soldier. There was no uniform to offer him protection under the rules of war, no formal exchange system to eventually bring him home. The women who carried coded letters folded into their hair or hidden beneath false bottoms in their luggage faced humiliating searches when Union suspicion did fall on them, and more than one found herself imprisoned for months on evidence that would never have held up in an ordinary court, because military authorities operating under suspended habeas corpus did not need much to justify an arrest. Free black couriers occupied an even more precarious position, moving through a landscape where their freedom itself could be challenged at any checkpoint, where a Confederate patrol might just as easily press them into forced labor as trust them with a message, and where the value of their local knowledge was constantly extracted by both sides without much regard for what happened to them once the war ended. The romantic version of Confederate espionage, the version with charming widows outwitting dull-witted generals over dinner, leaves out the much larger number of ordinary and often coerced people who made the actual physical movement of information possible, one dangerous river crossing at a time.
it is also worth resisting the temptation to treat every Confederate intelligence success as evidence of some uniquely brilliant Southern spycraft, because much of what made the system work in 1861 and 1862 was not cleverness so much as Union carelessness. Northern newspapers printed troop strengths and movement plans with a casualness that seems almost unbelievable in hindsight, treating the public's appetite for war news more important than operational security. And Confederate agents did not need to break any codes or steal any documents when a Washington paper would simply publish the information outright the next morning. Union officers, many of them still adjusting to the scale of the war they now found themselves fighting, spoke openly in hotel lobbies and boarding houses about plans that should never have left a command tent, and Southern sympathizing landladies and waiters listened without needing to ask a single leading question. As the war matured, both sides got better at guarding their own secrets, which is exactly why the intelligence advantage that had seemed so overwhelming in 1862 had narrowed considerably by 1864. The Confederacy's spies did not get worse. The environment that had made their job easy simply stopped existing.
There is a temptation, looking back at this story, to imagine espionage as some kind of secret weapon capable of deciding a war's outcome on its own, a hidden hand pulling strings behind the visible battles. The real history is more sobering, and in its own way more interesting. Confederate spies handed Lee some of the finest battlefield intelligence any general has ever received, intelligence that shaped victories at Manassas, in the 7 Days, and at Chancellorsville. That same intelligence apparatus, when it briefly failed him at Gettysburg, exposed just how dependent his success had been on information he could not always guarantee. And even at its absolute best, all that information could only ever tell Lee what he was up against. It could never change what he actually had to fight that enemy with. Belle Boyd, unlike Greenhow, lived to see the war's end and lived a long time after it, eventually turning her wartime notoriety into a stage career, touring the country giving dramatic lectures about her exploits to audiences who had grown hungry for stories from a war that was already, only a decade later, hardening into legend. Her later life is a reminder that the individuals who ran these networks were not abstractions or footnotes, but people who had to figure out how to live in a country that had reunited around them. Some celebrated, some quietly forgotten, some never fully trusted by either side again. Elizabeth Van Lew, the Union counterpart operating inside Richmond itself, was shunned by her own Virginia neighbors for the rest of her life once her wartime activities became known, a reminder that this was never really a story with a clean ending for anyone involved in it, regardless of which side they had served. Rose Greenhow died in 1864, drowned off the coast of North Carolina while trying to smuggle Confederate funds back from Europe, her small boat capsizing in a storm as she tried to reach shore, weighted down with gold sewn into her dress. She never lived to see the war end, and in some ways, her death captures the entire arc of Confederate espionage better than any battle report could. Brilliant, resourceful, willing to risk everything, and ultimately unable to outrun the much larger forces closing in from every direction. The Confederacy had some of the best spies of the 19th century. It simply did not have enough of anything else, and no secret, however well kept or well delivered, was ever going to change that.